There are moments in life that split everything into before and after. Not the dramatic moments you see coming, the ones you brace for, the ones grief counselors prepare you for. The ambush moments, the ones that find you already bleeding on the floor. Mine arrived at 2:47 in the afternoon on a Thursday in October, inside a room at Glasgow Royal Infirmary that smelled like antiseptic and recycled air, where the fluorescent lights hummed at a frequency I can still hear if I close my eyes, where a doctor I'd met 40 minutes earlier had just finished telling me that the cells they'd biopsied 3 days ago had come back positive for cervical cancer. I was 29 years old. I was 6 weeks away from my wedding, and I was lying in a hospital bed with an IV drip in my arm when the door opened and my sister Claire walked in holding my fiancé Daniel's hand. That image, that specific image, her French manicure, perfect little white tips laced between his fingers, his head slightly bowed, her eyes already wet with tears that I would spend the next several hours trying to understand. I'd called them both 47 minutes earlier. I'd made 2 separate calls, one to the man I was going to marry, and one to the only family I had left in the world, and I'd said the same thing to each of them. I need you. Come to the hospital. They need to talk to me about the results. They arrived together. The thing is, Daniel had been perfect, or what I'd understood perfect to mean at 26, which was before I understood that perfection in a partner is not a fixed quality, but a performance, and that performances eventually end. We'd met at a work Christmas party in a function suite on Bothwell Street, where the wine was warm and the playlist was 3 years out of date, and absolutely nobody was dancing. He'd been standing near the window with a glass of something red and a slightly desperate expression that I recognized immediately as belonging to someone who had also come alone and was also questioning the life choices that had led them here. I said, "This is not a great party." He said, genuinely and sincerely, "It might be the worst party I have ever attended." We talked for 2 hours and exchanged numbers, and he texted before he'd even made it to the car park, which I still thought about sometimes in the years that followed. That particular detail. Before he'd even made it to the car park, he was a financial analyst, methodical in the way that people who work with numbers become methodical, careful about facts, precise about language, the kind of person who says what he means because imprecision costs something in his world. He was patient. He had a dry sense of humor that appeared only in flashes, the kind that makes you feel let into something when it happens. He had a sister and a mother and a father and the full complement of family that I was slowly losing. And I think, though I wasn't fully aware of it at the time, that his family was part of what I loved about him. Proximity to wholeness. The warmth of a house where Christmas was still Christmas, and Sunday dinners still happened, and nobody was sick or grieving or counting down. He asked me to marry him on a Tuesday evening in our flat in Hinland, over dinner I'd cooked, without ceremony or performance. He said, "I want to spend my life with you. I want to be your person." He held out a ring box, my grandmother's ring, which he had asked my mother for in the months before she died, which he had carried for 3 months waiting for the moment to feel right. I said yes before he'd finished the sentence. "I loved him the way you love someone when you're 26, and you've already learned that love is not guaranteed, that the people you need can disappear without warning. I loved him the way people love things they've decided to trust. That's who was in the room with me when the door opened." If you've never been in a moment like that, let me try to explain what happens to your mind. It doesn't scream. It doesn't race. It goes very, very quiet. It starts cataloging things. Small things. The number of ceiling tiles you can see from where you're lying, which was 73. The exact pattern of the weave on the hospital blanket across your lap. The sound of a trolley being wheeled past in the corridor outside. The way Daniel wouldn't meet your eyes. "We need to tell you something," he said. My mother had died 8 months before that moment. Not suddenly, not without warning, but 8 months is not enough time to learn to live without someone who was your whole world. My father had been gone since I was 19. A cardiac arrest in the kitchen on an ordinary Tuesday morning. The kind of death that teaches you very young that safety is an illusion. I had no siblings except Claire. No family except the man I was supposed to marry in 6 weeks, and the sister I had helped raise when our mother got too sick to manage alone. I need you to understand what Claire was to me before I tell you what she did in that hospital room, because the cruelty of a betrayal is always proportional to the love it destroys. I'd dropped out of university at 21 to work double shifts at Tesco so that Claire could finish her degree at Strathclyde. I made that decision the way you make decisions when you're the eldest child of a sick mother and a younger sister who still has the whole world ahead of her. You do the math. You decide whose future is still salvageable and you sacrifice yours to protect it. I told myself it was temporary. I told myself I'd go back. I told myself it was worth it. I gave her $300 from my savings when she wanted to do a semester in Paris. Every pound I had. I transferred it from my account to hers on a Tuesday and ate toast for dinner for 3 weeks and told her to have the time of her life. She sent me postcards with pictures of the Eiffel Tower. I stuck them on my bedroom wall in the flat I shared with 2 strangers in Shawlands and thought, good. She's okay. She's getting everything she deserves. I was her maid of honor at her first wedding, the one that lasted 11 months before her husband left her for someone with a trust fund. I held her while she cried. I told her she was better than him. I meant it. That's the part that matters. I always meant it. So when I say Daniel and Claire arrived at the hospital together, I need you to feel the full weight of what that meant. I need you to understand that Claire was not a stranger. She was the person I had bled for. She was the person I had given up my degree for, my savings for, my future for, in the way that older sisters sometimes do when they love someone too much and ask for too little in return. We've been seeing each other for 5 months, Claire said. She had tears in her eyes. Actual tears. She stood in my hospital room with tears rolling down her face like she was the one who'd just received a cancer diagnosis. Like she was the one whose world was collapsing. Like she was the one suffering. We didn't mean for it to happen, but Daniel and I, we've realized we're soulmates. 5 months. I did the arithmetic automatically, the way your brain does when it's trying to make sense of something that doesn't compute. 5 months before that Thursday in October was May. May, when Daniel and I had taken a weekend trip to Edinburgh to celebrate our engagement. May, when Claire had come to dinner at ours and helped me look at wedding venues. May, when I had no idea. None. Not a flicker. I remember counting the ceiling tiles. 73 squares visible from where I lay. I counted them because I didn't know what else to do with my eyes. I couldn't look at them. I couldn't look at the door. I counted the ceiling tiles and I breathed, and I waited for the moment to end. Daniel walked to my bedside table. My grandmother's ring was there. I'd taken it off before the biopsy, before the IV went in, and I'd set it there because even then, even in those first terrifying minutes after the diagnosis, I'd thought about protecting it. My grandmother had worn that ring for 51 years. She'd given it to me 3 days before she died. Daniel picked it up. Just picked it up. Held it for a moment. And then Claire extended her hand, and he slid it onto her finger. I watched this happen. I watched my grandmother's ring leave the room on my sister's hand, and I kept counting the ceiling tiles, and I did not make a sound. "You'll understand eventually," Claire said. She was almost gentle about it. Almost kind. The kindness of someone who has already decided what they're going to do and just needs to get through the announcing of it. "You're strong. You've always been the strong one. You'll be fine." They left holding hands. The room was very quiet after they left. I lay there, and I listened to the sounds of the hospital continuing around me as if nothing had happened, as if my entire world hadn't just been rearranged behind the face of an ordinary Thursday afternoon. Trolleys moving in the corridor, voices somewhere at a nurse's station, someone's footsteps, quick and professional, passing my door without stopping, the fluorescent light humming at its particular frequency. The IV drip was still in my arm. The machine it was connected to beeped softly at intervals that I had already started to find reassuring, the rhythmic proof that my body was still working, still processing, still here even when everything else felt like it was leaving. I stared at the ceiling and I counted the tiles again. Not because I didn't already know the number, but because counting gave my mind something to hold on to while the rest of it tried to make sense of the last 40 minutes. 73. Every time. I thought about calling someone. This is what you do when something shattering happens. You think about who you'd call. I went through the list in my mind with the methodical quality of someone checking off items, one by one, and each time I reached the same conclusion. My mother, gone. My father, gone years before that. Claire, who had just left holding Daniel's hand. The friends from work who were colleagues more than friends. The kind of people you ate lunch with and complained about email volume with, and who would send a nice message when they heard about the cancer and then disappear. The friends from before, scattered now by the ordinary drift of adult life, a good group of women I hadn't been close to in years because life had moved and we hadn't all moved together. There was no one. I had 2 calls to make. I had already made them, 47 minutes ago. Both of those calls had led to the same place. Both of them had ended with a door clicking shut and 2 people walking out of a room into a world where they were a couple and I was a cancer diagnosis. I turned my head toward the window. It was afternoon, but the sky had the low gray quality of Glasgow in October, the specific gray that sits just above the rooftops and stays there for months without breaking. A pigeon was on the outer ledge of the window, doing whatever pigeons do, entirely unconcerned with the information I'd just received. I watched it for a while. It seemed like the right thing to watch. At some point, I started planning. This is, I think, what shock does when it finds a practical mind to work with. It stops the emotions somewhere just behind your ribs and routes around them, and it says, you need to think about what comes next. What needs to happen practically? What steps need to be taken? My treatment would start in 3 weeks. The consultant had explained the protocol clearly, as if clarity was the thing I needed. Chemotherapy, potentially followed by surgery, potentially followed by radiotherapy, depending on how the initial treatment responded. 3 weeks to arrange my affairs, he'd said, and I'd thought that an odd way to put it, but now I understood what he meant. 3 weeks to get the things around me in order before the harder business began. I made a mental list. Tell my employer. Deal with the flat. Find a way to manage the finances. All of this without Daniel. All of this without Claire. All of this alone. The pigeon was gone by the time the nurse came. I didn't hear it leave. The nurse found me an hour later, still staring at those 73 ceiling tiles, silent. She asked if I needed anything. She had a kind face, the nurse, tired in the way that people get when they spend their days inside other people's worst moments. She asked again, gently, "Is there anything I can get for you? Someone I can call?" I didn't know how to explain that what I needed was a family, and I just lost the last pieces of the one I had. You'll be fine. Those 3 words would live inside my chest for the next 2 years, like a splinter you can feel but can't reach. You'll be fine, said so casually, the way you say it to someone who's stubbed their toe. You'll be fine, as if a cancer diagnosis and an engagement ending and a lifetime of sacrifice being repaid with theft was something you could just get fine from. As if the strength I'd spent 29 years building was supposed to be armor against the specific pain of being abandoned by the 2 people you trusted most, in the worst moment of your life, while lying in a hospital bed. You'll be fine. I was discharged the following morning, a Friday. I walked out of Glasgow Royal Infirmary into grey October air that smelled like rain that hadn't decided to fall yet. And I stood on the pavement for a moment, adjusting to the specific reality of being outside, of being in the ordinary world again, a world that was still carrying on entirely normally despite the fact that the last 18 hours had rearranged everything I'd thought was solid. I took the bus back to the flat. Our flat. The flat I still shared, technically, with Daniel. The one in Hindland with the bay windows and the kitchen we'd chosen together, and the bookshelf that held books that were half mine and half his, and would need, at some point, to be sorted into separate piles. He hadn't been there when I got back. He'd left the night before and taken a bag, the efficient bag of someone who already knew they weren't coming back, and the wardrobe door was standing slightly open the way wardrobe doors stand open when someone has removed things hurriedly in the dark. I went to the window. I looked out at the street below. I thought about the fact that I had cancer. I thought about the fact that I didn't have a fiancé anymore. I thought about the fact that I didn't have a sister anymore. Not in any real sense. Not in any sense that meant what I needed it to mean. I stood there for a long time, and then I went to the kitchen and I made a cup of tea. Because making tea is what you do in Scotland when the world falls in, and it doesn't fix anything, but it gives your hands something to do. I rang my employer that afternoon. My creative director listened carefully and said all the right things in the right order, expressing sympathy and support and flexibility. And I said thank you, and I knew, with the particular clarity that comes from having nothing left to lose, that flexibility had its limits and my absence would begin to matter before my recovery was complete. I wasn't wrong. I slept in the flat for 3 weeks. In the room where Daniel's half-empty wardrobe stood open. In the bed where the pillow on the right side held the slight indentation of a head that was no longer sleeping there. In the flat that cost more than I would soon be able to afford. 3 weeks, and then I wasn't there anymore. I should tell you about the treatment. I should tell you about it because what comes later doesn't make sense without it, and because the thing about suffering is that it always feels abstract until you see the numbers. The cancer treatment cost me everything the hospital didn't cover. I had $1,847 in my account when I started chemotherapy. 6 months later, I had $230. That's what survival costs when you're doing it alone. That's what the gap looks like when you don't have a Daniel paying half the bills, or a Claire to call in an emergency. I lost my job at the marketing firm because I couldn't work through treatment. The creative director was sorry about it. He sent a card. He sent a very nice card with a gift voucher for a bookshop inside it, which I later discovered was worth 15s. That was the going rate for 4 years of my work, apparently. A 15 on bookshop voucher and a card that said hang in there. I lost the flat Daniel and I had rented because I couldn't make the $745 monthly rent alone. I had 30 days from the date he left it. I spent some of those days in hospital and the rest of them applying for emergency housing assistance and learning the specific texture of bureaucratic indifference. I was not a priority case, the housing officer explained. I had no children. I had no immediate safety risk. I was just a sick 29-year-old woman who couldn't pay her rent alone. The queue was long. I lost 18 pounds over 6 months of chemotherapy. I lost all my hair, which grew back slowly, in patches, at angles that made me look like something had gone wrong with the planting. I lost any remaining belief that the universe operated on some principle of fairness, that the amount of love you put in had any relationship to what you received, that doing the right thing had any guarantee attached to it. What I gained was a bedsit in Maryhill that cost $420 a month and smelled like damp and the previous tenant's 40 years of cigarettes. The shower had 2 temperatures, freezing and scalding, nothing between them, like some mechanical expression of the kind of life I was living. The radiator worked only when it wanted to, which was never during January, and January in Glasgow is not a month that forgives inadequate heating. I slept under 3 blankets from charity shops and my winter coat, and I lay awake in the cold dark, and I thought about those 73 ceiling tiles, and I thought about my grandmother's ring, and I thought about my sister's tears, and I thought, you have to get up tomorrow. Just get up tomorrow. I counted coins at the little checkout in Maryhill. Not metaphorically. I actually counted them, stacking them on the belt, and the cashiers learned to just wait while I did the arithmetic in my head and decided what to put back. Bread or milk, bread or milk. I got good at stretching jacket potatoes and baked beans across multiple meals. I got good at making 1 tea bag last 2 cups. There was a Tuesday in January. Not the Tuesday that saved me, which came later. A Tuesday in the middle of the worst winter of my life. I had woken at 5 in the morning because the radiator that never worked had produced, without warning, a single loud clank that had jolted me out of sleep and into the particular terror of the small hours in a cold room. The temperature was -2 outside. Inside, it was not much warmer. I lay under my 3 blankets and my winter coat, and I stared at the ceiling of the bedsit and I thought, with a clarity that scared me a little, I do not know how to do this. Not the cancer. The cancer I was managing, in the clinical sense of the word, in the sense that I was attending appointments and following protocols and doing the thing you do when your body is fighting something. Not the betrayal, which had settled into a specific and constant low-level ache, the way a healed injury aches in cold weather. What I meant, staring at that ceiling at 5 in the morning in January, was this: the getting through the next day. The managing of a life that had been stripped down to a level of basic survival I hadn't expected to be living at 29. I had 23 pounds left until the transcription work payment cleared at the end of the week. 23 pounds, and I needed to eat, and I needed to keep the electricity meter running, and I needed to get to my treatment appointment on Wednesday, which was 40 minutes away by bus, and I could walk it in good weather, but it was -2. And I had just finished a chemotherapy session 3 days ago, and I was exhausted in the particular bone-deep way of someone whose body is dealing with both an illness and a treatment for that illness simultaneously. I calculated it in my head, there in the dark. Bus fare both ways, 5 pounds. Food to last 5 days on 18 pounds, doable if I was careful. Electricity meter, needed a minimum of 3 pounds to not cut out before Thursday. I lay under the blankets and the coat, and I did the arithmetic, and then I got up. I always got up. But I want you to know about those mornings. I want you to know about the arithmetic, because when people hear the later part of this story, the sold-out launch and the flagship store and the flat in the West End, they sometimes imagine that recovery is a straight upward line. It isn't. It's a series of January mornings in -2 temperatures, under 3 blankets and a coat, doing the arithmetic again and choosing to get up anyway. I walked 40 minutes to the library instead of taking the bus. 2.50 saved. I charged my phone there because the electricity meter at the bedsit ate 50p coins at a rate that felt personal, felt vindictive, like the building itself was trying to drain the last of me. I borrowed their books instead of buying them. I sat at their computers and applied for jobs until my eyes blurred. I'd submitted applications for 89 positions in 4 months. 3 interviews. No offers. I want to tell you what those 89 applications felt like because the number alone doesn't capture it. Each one was its own small exercise in hope and humiliation. Researching the company, tailoring the cover letter, trying to explain the gap in my CV with language that was honest. Without being so honest, it ended the application before it began. Medical circumstances, personal circumstances, a period of significant challenge, now resolved. I got good at euphemism. I got good at the particular tone of someone presenting the least frightening version of their recent history to strangers who held their future in a 10-second glance at a document. The silence after each application was its own thing. There's a specific quality to waiting. When you have nothing to do while you wait, when waiting is the only available option, when the answer that might change everything is sitting in someone's inbox, and they may open it today or not for 2 weeks, or not at all. I waited for 89 applications. I heard back from 7. I got interviews from 3. I sat in those 3 interviews in a jumper I'd washed so many times it had thinned at the elbows, with my hair grown back in the uneven way it had grown back. And I answered questions about my strengths and my 5-year vision, and I wanted to say, my strength is that I'm still here. My 5-year vision is that I'm not counting coins at a checkout. I didn't say that. I smiled and I answered professionally, and then I went back to the library computer and I kept applying. Turns out a 7-month gap in your CV for medical reasons makes you unemployable. Turns out the working world has very little patience for the inconvenient truth that bodies sometimes break down, that illness takes time, that survival is not a clean or linear process. I was 29, and I had marketing experience and design skills, and I had spent 7 months fighting for my life, and not one of those 89 companies wanted to give me a chance. There's something poverty steals that isn't money, and I want you to understand this because it matters. It steals dignity in ways that compound. The inability to offer someone a cup of tea because you've rationed your last 2 tea bags for yourself. The shame of avoiding friends because you can't afford a coffee shop, can't split a bill, can't reciprocate anything. The way you start to answer questions about yourself with smaller and smaller answers because you have less and less to claim. I had been a person with a career and a fiancé and a life that was going somewhere. I had become a person who calculated whether I could afford the bus. Claire married Daniel that November. The ceremony was at Cameron House on Loch Lomond, which, if you know Scotland, you know is not where people who struggle spend their wedding budget. According to the Daily Record Society pages, it cost upward of 35 Zallar. I know because someone sent me the link before I deleted my Facebook account, the link with photographs of Claire in white, carrying roses, smiling the way people smile when they have gotten exactly what they wanted and don't intend to think too hard about the cost. She wore my grandmother's ring in the photographs. I could see it in the close-up shots. That ring, which had been on my grandmother's hand for 51 years, which had sat on my bedside table in the hospital while I heard the word cancer for the first time, which Daniel had slid onto my sister's finger while I counted ceiling tiles. It gleamed in the wedding photographs like it had always belonged there. I closed my laptop. I made a cup of tea with one of my rationed tea bags. I looked out the window at the gray Maryhill Street below, and I said, out loud, to no one, "You are going to survive this. You don't know how yet, but you are going to survive this." My grandmother had given me that ring on a Tuesday afternoon in a ward at the Southern General, 3 days before she died. She'd been in the ward for 6 weeks by then, and we all knew what was coming. Though none of us said it in those terms, the way families don't say it directly as if not saying it might delay the fact. She'd taken the ring off herself, which I hadn't expected. Her hands were thin by then, the joints more prominent than they'd been, and she'd worked it over her knuckle with a patience that I'd watched without breathing. She put it into my palm and closed my fingers around it, and she said, "This ring went to church for 51 years. It never left my hand except to be cleaned. Your grandfather put it there, and I intend it to stay in this family." She was not a sentimental woman, my grandmother. She was the kind of woman who'd survived things I couldn't fully imagine, who'd buried a husband and a son, and who measured her words carefully because she'd learned early that words you said couldn't be unsaid. She didn't say she loved me, not in those words. She gave me 51 years of marriage in the form of a ring, and she trusted me to understand what she meant. I had kept it safe for 7 years before that Thursday in October. 7 years of being careful with it because I knew what it carried. And now it was in a wedding photograph, gleaming on the wrong hand, in a setting that cost £35,000 on the shore of Loch Lomond. I didn't feel it. I just said it. Sometimes saying a thing is the only way to start believing it. I want to tell you about a Tuesday in March, because that Tuesday was the exact moment when the trajectory of my life changed. Not dramatically. Not with any fanfare. It was a Tuesday like any other Tuesday, gray and ordinary, and I was sitting at a computer in the Maryhill Library in a wool jumper that I'd washed so many times it had thinned at the elbows, and I opened an email. The subject line said, "Design Inquiry," and the name at the top was Moira Hutchinson. She'd found my old portfolio website. I had almost forgotten it existed, that website. Built in the years when I'd done freelance graphic design to supplement my marketing salary. Back when I was someone who thought about building things rather than just surviving them. The website was 3 years old and badly out of date, and I'd been meaning to take it down for months but hadn't, maybe because taking it down felt like one more thing I'd lost. Moira was starting a sustainable fashion company. She needed branding work. Her budget was $500. I stared at that number for a long time. Long enough that the woman at the computer beside me glanced over, probably wondering what I was reading. I wasn't reading anything. I was just breathing, very carefully, because the $500 was more money than I'd seen in one place since before the chemotherapy, and someone was offering it to me for work I actually knew how to do. I cried. I'm not embarrassed to tell you that. I sat in the Maryhill Library at a computer terminal, and I cried, quietly, with my hand over my mouth, and then I wiped my face, and I replied. We met at a cafe in Finiston the following week. Moira was in her early 50s, with graying hair she wore pulled back and eyes that had the look of someone who has thought carefully about most things and doesn't waste words on the rest. She bought me lunch, a proper meal, chicken and roasted vegetables and actual food, the kind of meal I hadn't eaten in longer than I wanted to admit. I ate it slowly and tried not to let my face show how good it tasted, how long it had been. She told me about her vision. An uncle had left her money, 180,000, and she'd spent a year deciding what to do with it. She wanted to build a sustainable fashion brand, ethical manufacturing, recycled materials, the kind of thing that meant something in a market saturated with fast fashion and hollow sustainability claims. She showed me fabric samples and rough sketches and talked about what she wanted it to feel like, the aesthetic, the values, the audience. Then she said, I've read about you. I went still. There was an article, she continued carefully, watching my face, about young cancer survivors in Glasgow. You were featured 2 years ago, before your diagnosis. You talked about wanting to use design to make the world better. I had forgotten I'd said that. I had forgotten I had been someone who thought in those terms. Somewhere between the hospital room and the bedsit and 89 job applications, I had stopped being someone who wanted to make the world better and started being someone who was just trying to make it to the next week. I don't just need a designer, Moira said. She set down her tea and looked at me directly. I need a partner. Someone who understands building something from nothing. I'll cover costs, but I want you in on every decision. 20% equity if you'll come on board properly. I looked at this woman I had met 40 minutes ago. I thought about the last 2 years. I thought about counting coins at Lidl and walking 40 minutes in the rain and the radiator that never worked and the shower with only 2 temperatures. I thought about 89 job applications and 3 interviews and no offers. I thought about my grandmother's ring in a wedding photograph. Why me? I asked. She didn't hesitate. Because your portfolio shows talent, and your story shows resilience. I can teach the rest. But resilience? She paused. You either have it or you don't. I started the following Monday at a shared workspace on Argyle Street. Real desk, real computer, real work. The kind of work I was good at, had always been good at. The kind that makes time disappear because you're actually building something rather than just filling hours. Moira paid me $800 a month as a draw against future profits. And I know to some people that doesn't sound like much, but it was enough. It was enough to move out of the bedsit in Maryhill and into a proper studio flat in Dennistoun, somewhere with insulation and a heating system that responded to the thermostat and a shower with actual adjustable temperature. The first night in that flat, I stood under a hot shower that I had turned to exactly the right temperature, just warm enough to loosen the knot in my shoulders, and I cried for 20 minutes. Not sad crying, not relieved crying. Something more complicated than either of those things. The kind of crying that happens when your body finally believes something your mind has been trying to convince it of for a very long time. You are going to be okay. You are actually going to be okay. Here's what nobody tells you about rebuilding. It's not dramatic. It's 60-hour weeks in a workspace on Argyle Street, going home at 9 in the evening to eat dinner standing at your kitchen counter because you're too tired to sit down. It's designing the same logo 20 times until it's right. It's spreadsheets and supplier negotiations and learning things you don't know because you have to. It's Moira on the phone at 7 in the morning with a problem that needs solving and you solving it because the alternative is not an option you're willing to consider. What I want to tell you about, though, is the part nobody captures in a business profile. Not the sold-out launch and not the revenue numbers and not the stockists in 7 cities. The part that happened in between, in the evenings on Argyle Street when the workspace was empty, and just Moira and I were there, going over supplier contracts and arguing cheerfully about color palettes and building something that we were making up as we went along, because neither of us had done exactly this before. Moira argued for a palette of deep jewel tones, emerald and burgundy and rich midnight blue. I kept pushing back toward something quieter, slate and stone and the particular warm off-white of unbleached linen. We compromised eventually on collections that contained both. The jewel tones for statement pieces, the quieter colors for the everyday line, a range that felt coherent because we'd argued every inch of it into shape. I learned things I didn't know I needed to learn. Ethical certifications and what they actually meant versus what companies claimed they meant. Supply chain transparency and why it mattered and how to write about it without it sounding like marketing copy. The difference between a customer who bought once because a blog mentioned you and a customer who came back because the product had lasted and the values had meant something. The first time someone emailed us to say they'd had a piece for 18 months and it had only gotten better with wear, I printed the email and kept it in a folder. I still have that folder. There were things that went wrong. A manufacturer we'd chosen based on their certifications, who turned out to have practices that didn't match their claims, and the cost of switching, both financial and logistical, and the decision to absorb that cost because we'd built something on integrity, and that was not a word we were prepared to make negotiable. A launch event that was rained out entirely, genuinely torrential Glasgow rain. 23 people standing under umbrellas in Merchant City having what became, despite itself, a rather good evening. A website crash on the morning of our second collection drop that took 4 hours to resolve, and during which Moira and I sat at our desks with cups of tea getting cold beside us and worked through the problem with the methodical calm of people who have both survived worse. We always came through it. Every time. What I gained in those early years was something I hadn't anticipated. A friendship of the kind I hadn't had since before everything fell apart. Not the friendship of shared history or shared geography, the friendships that form by accident and persist by proximity. The friendship of two people who choose each other deliberately, who know exactly what the other is capable of because they have seen each other under pressure, and who trust each other not because nothing has yet tested that trust, but because everything already has. Moira knew the full story by the end of the first month. I'd told her in pieces, without planning to, the way you tell things to people you trust before you've consciously decided to trust them. She listened without horror and without performance. She just absorbed it. The way practical people absorb difficult information, and she said, "Right. So you know how to survive almost anything." Good. We're going to need that. I did not take that for granted, not for a single day. We launched in September with a collection of 12 pieces made from recycled materials and organic cotton. We sold out in 11 days. I remember the moment the last piece sold. I was sitting at my desk on Argyle Street watching the website numbers tick upward, and then I refreshed and we were sold out. Completely sold out. 11 days after launch, and I sat back in my chair and I thought, we did that. We built that. Nobody gave us that. We built it. I started thinking beyond survival for the first time in 2 years. I made lists. I had been making survival lists for so long. Lists of what I couldn't afford. Lists of what I needed to stretch further. Lists of bills and debts and calculations. And now I was making different lists. Expand the product line. Collaborate with local artists. Develop a wholesale strategy. My brain remembered how to build instead of just endure. By the second year, we had stockists in 7 cities. Fashion bloggers featured us. The Herald ran a profile on Moira that mentioned me as the creative force behind the brand's aesthetic, and I read it 3 times before I believed it was about me. People at networking events recognized my name, not pitying recognition, not the name of someone who'd been sick or lost everything. My name as a designer, as someone building something that mattered. I ran into former colleagues from the marketing firm at a trade show. They complimented our booth, said they'd been following our success. One of them, a woman called Sarah, who'd been in the department below mine, leaned in and said, "Do you remember Daniel? He's working at his dad's car dealership now. Heard the finance job didn't work out." I found that I had to think for a moment to even place the name. Daniel. Yes, Daniel. I hadn't thought about him in months, I said, and I meant it, and the realization was its own quiet satisfaction. Not the roaring satisfaction I might have expected in those early days of loss and rage. Just a clean, quiet recognition that he had stopped taking up space inside me at some point, without me even noticing. What I didn't know was that Claire's perfect life had been cracking for a while before it broke. A friend from university, one of the few I'd maintained contact with through everything, sent me a text in November. "Have you seen Claire's Instagram lately? Something's off." I hadn't looked at Claire's social media in 3 years. I'd deleted my own accounts and avoided hers the way you avoid the street where you used to live, not because you're afraid of it exactly, but because you know that nothing good comes from looking. But I looked that night. Sat in my flat in Denistone with a glass of wine I could actually afford, and scrolled through my sister's Instagram feed for the first time in 3 years. The photos had changed. Fewer of Daniel, fewer of the house, the holidays, the restaurant meals. More of Claire alone in what I recognized as carefully curated self-care aesthetics. The kind of photos people post when they're performing contentment for an audience because the alternative is posting the truth. Captions about growth and finding yourself in the journey. Comments from friends that read sympathetic rather than celebratory. Her replies, vague and deflecting. 2 weeks later, my friend texted again. "Daniel's been having an affair. Multiple, apparently. Everyone knows. Claire's trying to keep it quiet, but it's everywhere." I sat with this information for a long time. I examined myself for what I was feeling. The way you'd check yourself for injuries after an accident. Was there satisfaction? A little, I won't lie to you. Was there sympathy? No. And I want to be honest about that absence of sympathy, because I think it matters. Sympathy requires a kind of bridge between two people's pain, and Claire had burned that bridge in a hospital room when I was at my lowest. What I felt, mostly, was nothing. And that nothing felt cleaner than any emotion I'd expected. 2 weeks after that, on a Thursday afternoon, my phone rang. Claire's name appeared on the screen. I stared at it for 4 rings. 4 long rings in which I thought about 73 ceiling tiles, and an IV drip, and the sound of a door clicking shut on people leaving. Then I answered. She was crying. Not the controlled tears she'd produced in my hospital room, the strategic tears of someone announcing bad news. These were messier. Real, I thought, in the way that pain is real when it has no audience in mind. "I need help," she said. "Daniel left me. He's been cheating for years. He took everything. The house was in his name. The car was in his name. I have nothing. Mum would want you to help me." A pause, and then the words that told me she had thought very carefully about what would work on me. "You're my sister." There it was, the appeal to family, to obligation. To the girl I'd been at 21 who gave everything, because that's what you do for family. That girl had existed. She'd given $400 in savings and her university education, and years of double shifts, and the best of herself to the person who was now on the phone asking for more. "Come to my office tomorrow," I said. 2 o'clock. I chose our design studio in the city deliberately. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the Clyde, which was running high and steel gray and fast in the January cold. Our products displayed on minimalist shelving along one wall. Framed press coverage arranged carefully. The Herald profile, a feature in a national fashion magazine, A photograph of Moira and me at the launch of our second collection. I wanted Claire to see everything I had built from the ashes she'd left me in. I wanted her to walk through it before we said a single word. I spent that night in my flat in the West End, going through the things I was going to say, and the things I wasn't going to say, and the difference between them. I was not going to say, "You destroyed me." Not because it wasn't true, but because it had been true, and was no longer true, and saying it would have made it present again in a way I didn't want it to be. The destroying had happened, and I had built something from it, and the something I'd built was more real to me now than the destroying. I was not going to say, "You should feel ashamed of yourself," because whatever shame Claire was capable of was her own business and not my responsibility to invoke. I was going to say exactly what I said. I had rehearsed it until it was clean. Not cruel, not cold, just honest. The accounting of what had been given and what had been taken and what was being offered now, once, with no expectation of gratitude. I thought about my grandmother's ring. It was gone now, I'd heard, sold for a pawnshop price, and I had let myself grieve it properly in the months since I'd heard. I had given it the specific mourning it deserved, the ring and what it had represented, and what it meant that it had ended that way. I had let it go. I was not going to bring it to the meeting because I was done carrying weight that didn't belong to me anymore. I slept well that night. Better than I'd expected. There is something clarifying about a decision made cleanly, about knowing exactly what you're going to do and having made your peace with it. I slept well, and I woke early, and I walked to the studio in the clear January cold feeling, for the first time in a long time, entirely ready. That night, I told Moira everything. I sat across from her at the desk and I told her the whole story, from the hospital room to the bedsit, to Lidl and the coins and the library, and the walk to save the bus fare. I told her about the French manicure interlaced with Daniel's fingers. I told her about the ring. Moira listened the way she always listened, without interrupting, without performing sympathy, just fully present with everything I was saying. When I finished, she said, "What do you need from me tomorrow?" "I need you in the room," I said. "I need a witness." "Then I'll be there," she said. Claire arrived at 2:00 wearing pieces from our collection. I noticed immediately. 2 items, both from our second year, pieces that retail at $120 each. The irony arranged itself so neatly it almost felt scripted. She had spent Daniel's money on the clothing brand her sister built from the ashes of the life Daniel and Claire had destroyed. She looked smaller than I remembered. Older. Tired in a way that concealer had been applied over but hadn't successfully hidden. Life has a way of showing on people who haven't had to work for their softness, who've taken ease for granted. When the ease disappears, the face registers it. "Thank you for seeing me," she started. "Sit down." Moira sat beside me. Claire sat across from us. She took in the office with the involuntary assessment of someone realizing, perhaps for the first time, what their actions had cost someone else. The press coverage on the walls, the products on the shelving. The view of the Clyde through floor-to-ceiling glass. Whatever she'd expected my life to look like after everything, it wasn't this. She explained her situation methodically, the way people do when they've rehearsed it. Daniel had been having multiple affairs, some apparently known to their social circle for years. He had drained their joint account before leaving, $12,000, and by the time she'd understood what was happening, it was gone. The house had been in his name from the beginning because she'd had no income to contribute to the mortgage, and so the paperwork had been written to reflect that. 3 years as a stay-at-home wife had left her without recent work experience, without professional references, without a CV that meant anything in the current market. She had $890 in her personal account. I listened to all of this. I let her finish. I watched her face as she told me the parts that were hard to say, the parts that required swallowing pride she'd spent years building on the foundations of other people's work. Then I said, "You told me I was strong. When you came to my hospital room to tell me that you'd been sleeping with my fiancé for 5 months, When you took my grandmother's ring off my bedside table, you told me I was strong. You said I'd be fine. Do you remember saying that?" The color in her face changed. "I was horrible," she said. "I was selfish and cruel, and I've regretted it every day since." "Have you?" I leaned forward. The anger I was feeling was not hot. It was cold and precise and years old. "Did you regret it at your 35,000-pound wedding? Did you regret it in the house you lived in while I was eating beans in a bedsit that cost 420 pounds a month? Did you regret it when you wore my grandmother's ring on your finger for 3 years?" For a moment, something in her face shifted. A different kind of desperation, the kind that comes when the approach you've prepared hasn't landed and you're reaching for something else, some other lever, some other way in. "Mum would want us to be okay," she said. "You know that. You know she'd want us to look after each other." I had expected this. The invocation of our mother was the card I'd known she'd play eventually, the trump she'd been holding in reserve. It was, I'll grant her, well aimed. Our mother had spent her last months worrying about us, about what would happen when she was gone, about whether we'd hold together or fall apart. She'd said in her final weeks, "You girls only have each other." She'd said, "Promise me you'll take care of each other." I had remembered that promise every day for years. I had remembered it in the hospital room, counting ceiling tiles, watching my grandmother's ring leave on my sister's finger. I had remembered it in the Maryhill bedsit, under the coat and the blankets, doing the arithmetic for bus fare. I had remembered it when I saw the wedding photographs and when I read about the affair, and when the phone had rung a week ago and Claire's name had appeared on the screen. "She would have wanted you to be there for me," Claire continued, with an edge now that hadn't been there before, a desperation working its way toward accusation. "When she was alive, you would have been there for me. You've changed." "I have changed," I said. "That's the correct observation." "You're hard. You've become hard." I thought about the 23 pounds on the Tuesday in January. I thought about the walk in the rain to save the bus fare. I thought about the radiator that never worked, and the shower with 2 temperatures, and the bar soap I'd used for my hair because conditioner was not in the budget. I thought about my grandmother's ring in a pawn shop somewhere. "I became what the circumstances required," I said. "That's different from hard." She looked at Moira again, appealing silently. And Moira met her gaze and said nothing, and offered nothing, and I felt in that moment an uncomplicated gratitude for Moira that was deeper than anything I could easily put into words. "I gave you everything I had," I said. "For years before the hospital, and for years before that. I gave it because I loved you, and because you were my sister, and because I thought that was what you did for family. And I would do it again. Not for you, but I would do it again for someone who deserved it. That's who I am. That has not changed." I paused. "What has changed is who gets it." "I'm sorry," she whispered. The thing about "I'm sorry," said in the right tone, is that it wants to be enough. It presents itself as currency, as if the saying of it settles the account. I watched her say it, and I felt very clearly that it was not enough, and that no number of sorries ever could be. Not because I was unforgiving, but because some things can't be paid back that way. The 2 years in the bedsit couldn't be apologized into not having happened. The 89 job applications and the 3 interviews and the coins at the Lidl checkout couldn't be undone by the right words in the right office. "I slept under my coat," I said, "because I couldn't afford heating. I walked until my feet blistered because I couldn't afford the bus. I counted coins for food while you posted pictures of restaurant meals on Facebook with filters that made them look like a lifestyle. You are sorry now because you are in the position you put me in. You are sorry because you need something." Her eyes went to Moira, looking for softness. Moira's expression did not offer any. I reached for the folder she'd prepared. Inside was a printout of a bedsit listing. Maryhill. The same building where I'd spent 18 months counting coins and wearing my coat to bed and waiting for a radiator that never worked. A unit had just become available. $420 a month. I slid it across the desk to Claire. "Here's what I'll do," I said. "I'll give you the deposit and first month's rent for this place. I'll connect you with the transcription company I worked for. They pay £8 to £12 per hour if you're fast and accurate. There's a food bank 2 streets over from that address that's open Tuesdays and Thursdays. The library has free Wi-Fi and workshops on CV writing." Claire looked at the folder, then at me, then at the folder again. "This is exactly what I had when you left me with nothing. You said I was strong enough to survive it. Let's see if you are." There's a particular quality to silence in a room where something true has just been said. Not the silence of awkwardness or of nothing to say, but the silence of a truth landing in a space that had no room for it until it arrived. That was the silence that filled the office. The Clyde moved outside the window, gray and relentless. The press coverage on the walls didn't change. The products on the shelving didn't shift. Everything was exactly as it had been. Claire stared at the folder the way you stare at something you'd rather not look at, but can't look away from. "You're really going to let me suffer?" she said. "I'm giving you exactly what you gave me. The opportunity to be fine." I kept my voice level. Not cruel, not cold, just honest. "You said I'd be fine, remember? So you'll be fine too." She looked at Moira one more time. Moira looked back. Nothing on offer there. "You can take this help or not," I continued, "but this is the only help you'll get from me. No money beyond this. No job at my company, no room in my home. You wanted to see who was stronger. Here's your chance to find out." Claire took the folder with hands that weren't entirely steady. She stood up. She looked at me for a long moment. That particular look of someone trying to understand whether you've changed or whether you've simply revealed yourself. Then she walked out of the office without another word. Moira waited until we heard the lift doors close. Then she said, "You did exactly the right thing." I looked out at the Clyde. "Did I?" "You gave her more than she gave you," Moira said simply. "You gave her a starting point. She gave you a hospital room and a ceiling to stare at." I sat with that for a while. The afternoon light was shifting on the water. Somewhere in Maryhill, the same bedsit building stood with its damp walls and its temperamental radiator and its shower with 2 temperatures and its electricity meter that ate 50p coins like they were nothing. Somewhere in that building a room was available, $420 a month, and I had just handed its details to my sister. I felt something I hadn't expected to feel. Not triumph, though there was something of that in it. Not vindication exactly, though that was present too. What I felt, mostly, was free. Some weight I'd been carrying so long I'd stopped noticing it had lifted, quietly, while I was sliding that folder across a desk. The months that followed felt different. I don't know if this makes sense to anyone who hasn't been through something like it, but there's a specific way that unresolved grief and anger occupy your body, like a low-level hum that you learn to live with, that you start to mistake for normal. When it's gone, everything is quieter. Everything costs a little less. I slept better. I designed better. I stopped waking at 3 in the morning with the image of Claire's French manicure interlaced with Daniel's fingers. I heard updates through mutual acquaintances over the following year. Claire moved into the bedsit. She lasted 4 months, which is, I'll acknowledge, longer than I expected. 4 months of the damp and the temperamental radiator, and the coins for the electricity meter before she called our aunt in Edinburgh, our father's sister who we'd maintained only minimal contact with over the years, and begged for help. The aunt apparently said yes. Brought Claire to Edinburgh, gave her a spare room, found her administrative work at a medical office. And here is where the story becomes more complicated than just my satisfaction at justice served. Claire got a safety net. She hit rock bottom and someone caught her. I had hit rock bottom and fallen straight through it. She ended up with what I would have had if there had been anyone to catch me. Family support, a room and a house, a starting point that someone else provided. The precise thing I'd been denied when I needed it most. There's a version of me that might have been angry about this. The version of me who lay in that Mary Hill bedsit in January under 3 charity shop blankets and her winter coat, calculating whether she could afford the bus. That version of me might have raged at the unfairness of it, that Claire could blow up both our lives and still land softer than I had. But I wasn't that version of me anymore. I hadn't been for a while. What I felt, when I heard about the aunt in Edinburgh and the administrative job, was something close to perspective. Claire had survived, the same way I had survived, but with assistance, and I had survived without it. And that difference wasn't the only difference between us. The real difference was what we built from the surviving. I had built because building was the only direction available to me. When you have nothing and no one to catch you and no floor to land on, you either build or you disappear. I had chosen, every day, sometimes minute by minute, to build. The portfolio website I'd been too broke and exhausted to take down. The email from Moira that arrived on a Tuesday in March. The 60-hour weeks on Argyle Street. The sold-out launch. The stockists in 7 cities. The Herald profile. The flagship store in Merchant City with its 12 employees and its floor-to-ceiling windows. And the Clyde visible on a clear day. Daniel, I heard, moved to England with whoever had been the most recent affair. He lost that job 8 months later. Last anyone could verify, he was working retail in Manchester and living with his parents at 48 years old. My grandmother's ring, according to someone who'd heard from someone who knew, sold, pawned, to cover debts. The ring that had been on my grandmother's hand for 51 years. The ring that had been on my bedside table when I received a cancer diagnosis. The ring that Claire had let him slide onto her finger in my hospital room while I counted ceiling tiles. Gone for whatever a pawn shop offered for it. I let myself feel that for a moment. The ring, the 51 years it had represented. The way it had looked in the wedding photographs, gleaming like it had always belonged there, gone for a pawnshop price toward someone's debts. Then I let it go. Some things you grieve and release, some things you hold on to and they just become weight. I want to tell you what that actually looked like, practically. The letting go. Because it's easy to write those words and have them sound like a single decision, like one clean gesture. Like you can just declare a thing released and it releases. That's not how it works. What it looked like was a Tuesday morning in my flat in the West End when I was drinking coffee and reading the news, and I realized I had gone 6 days without thinking about the hospital room. 6 full days. I noticed the absence the way you notice a sound has stopped. The specific quality of quiet where something used to be. I sat with my coffee and I thought, oh, something is different. It looked like the night I went through my phone contacts for the first time in years and found Daniel's number still there, in the D section, and deleted it without any particular feeling at all. Just deleted it. A clean housekeeping action. The removal of something that no longer needed to take up space. It looked like designing the 3rd collection and realizing partway through that I was designing for joy. Purely for joy. For the pleasure of the colors and the shapes, and the feeling of building something beautiful. Not designing to survive, not designing to prove something to anyone, not designing as the only lifeline available to me. Designing because I loved it. I'd forgotten what that felt like. I'd forgotten I had access to that particular feeling. These are small things, but they were the small things that added up to the truth I know now. That healing isn't a moment or a decision. It's a series of ordinary Tuesdays where you realize, gradually, that the weight you've been carrying has quietly become lighter. My company crossed $500,000 in revenue in year 4. Moira and I opened a flagship store in Merchant City. 12 employees. An approach from a boutique investment firm about expansion funding. My salary reached a level where I stopped running calculations before I bought groceries, where I could order something at a cafe without checking the price first, where I could book a train ticket for the same day if I needed to. I know this sounds like a small thing. It is not a small thing. The ability to move through the world without constant financial arithmetic is a form of freedom that you cannot understand until you've lost it. I bought a flat in the West End, high ceilings with original cornicing from the Victorian era. Windows on the south side that let in so much afternoon light that I sometimes sat and watched dust motes move through it, golden and slow, like time slowing down enough for me to actually be in it. I furnished it slowly and carefully, not filling it up but choosing things I loved, things I wanted to live with for a long time. Books I actually wanted to read. Art from local artists I'd met through work. A kitchen table where I could eat a meal sitting down without counting anything. A bathroom with a shower that had adjustable temperature and a tub deep enough to sink into with a book and a glass of wine. Heating that turned on when I wanted it to. I want to tell you about the women who started reaching out after the industry profiles and the press coverage mentioned my story. Cancer survivor, sustainable fashion brand, the creative force behind it, all of that. Women who had been through their own versions of what I'd been through, betrayal and loss and poverty and rebuilding from nothing. They found my email through the company website or through LinkedIn or through contacts of contacts, and they wrote messages that all contained some version of the same question. How did you do it? How did you get from there to here? I thought carefully about how to answer this. I didn't want to give them a motivational poster. I didn't want to pretend it had been clean or linear, or that I'd had some reserve of strength that just needed to be accessed. So I told them the truth. I almost didn't. There were days in that Maryhill bedsit where I lay under 3 blankets and my coat, and I did not want to get up the next morning. Not in a dramatic way, not in a way that required intervention, just in the way of someone who has been exhausted for so long that the idea of another day of the same exhaustion is its own particular despair. I ate beans on toast and calculated coins and walked 40 minutes in the rain and told myself to get up tomorrow, and some days that was all I had. But I also told them about Moira, about the portfolio website I'd been too tired to take down, about the Tuesday in March and the email and the $500 and the meeting at a cafe in Finiston, where a woman bought me a proper meal and said the word resilience like she actually meant it. About taking the chance when it came. About 60-hour weeks because the alternative was going back to counting coins. About choosing every day to believe I deserved better even when I had no evidence the universe agreed. You don't need to forgive people who destroyed you, I said, in those conversations, and in the 1 or 2 interviews where the question came up. You don't need to be the bigger person before you're ready. What you need to do is survive. And then you need to build something they can never touch. That became something I actually believed. Not just said, believed. I see Claire occasionally. Family events, the kind you can't entirely avoid. Our aunt's birthday gatherings in Edinburgh, a distant cousin's wedding last year in Stirling. The awkward gathering of people who share blood and history and not much else. We are civil. We exchange pleasantries about work and weather and ask after each other's lives in the way of people who are performing a relationship rather than having one. She works her administrative job. She has a small flat in Edinburgh now, her own space. A life of reasonable ordinariness built from the ruins of the one she'd expected. She's fine, as it turns out. I noticed, at the cousin's wedding last summer, that she was wearing a ring on her right hand. Not my grandmother's ring. Something simpler. A thin silver band with a small stone that could have been her own choice rather than anyone's legacy. I looked at it for a moment, and then looked away. That story was over. It had been over for a while. The difference between us is not wealth, though the wealth is real. It's not success, though the success is real too. The difference is what we chose to do with the wreckage. And I'm aware, I want to be honest about this, that I had help. Moira was the version of the aunt that I didn't get. The email was the version of the safety net that arrived differently for me than it arrived for Claire. I was not entirely alone in my building. Nobody is entirely alone in their building. But I had been alone in my falling. I had hit the floor and fallen through it and landed somewhere that had no name on the map, somewhere the heating didn't work, and the radiator ate 50p coins and the shower had 2 temperatures. I had been alone in all of that, and I had gotten up. Every day, I had gotten up. There is a specific peace that comes from knowing you have survived the worst version of your own life. Not the peace of contentment, not the peace of things being easy, but something more solid than either of those. A bedrock knowledge that you tested yourself in conditions that were designed to break you, and you did not break. That knowledge does not diminish. It compounds. Every year I run the company, every collection we launch, every employee I pay a living wage, every West End morning I wake up in my flat with the high ceilings and the south-facing light and the heating that turns on when I want it to. That knowledge is there. I was 31 years old when Moira emailed me. I was 29 when I lay in a hospital room and counted ceiling tiles while my sister put my grandmother's ring on her own hand. I am years past both of those moments now, and I have learned something that I didn't know how to say at 29 or at 31 or even at 35. The strength that Claire saw in me in that hospital room was real. She wasn't wrong about that. She was cruel and selfish and wrong about almost everything that day. But she was not wrong about that. I was strong enough to survive it. I proved it. What she didn't understand, what she couldn't have understood from where she was standing, is that the strength wasn't mine alone. It was built from everything I'd been through before that moment. Every double shift at Tesco so she could finish her degree. Every pound given so she could have her semester in Paris. Every choice I'd made to put someone else first. All of that had made me into someone who knew how to endure, who'd learned that endurance was not the same as defeat, who understood at a cellular level that hardship was survivable because I'd been surviving it quietly for years before the crisis. The irony of it. She helped make me exactly who I needed to be to survive what she did to me. I don't tell this story for revenge, though I won't pretend there is no satisfaction in the telling. I tell it because I know there are women right now in their own versions of that Mary Hill bedsit, counting their own coins at their own checkouts, walking their own 40-minute journeys in the rain because the bus costs what it costs. I tell it because I know what it feels like to be invisible in the city where you used to have a life. To disappear because you can't afford to be present. To apply for 89 jobs and receive 3 interviews and no offers and keep applying anyway. I tell it because Moira exists. Not necessarily Moira exactly, but the equivalent of her. The email that arrives on a Tuesday in March when you've almost stopped checking. The opportunity that finds you because you kept a portfolio website live even when you were too exhausted to do anything with it. The chance that presents itself when you've been small enough, humble enough, desperate enough to recognize it for what it is and take it. You don't need to know how yet. You need to get up tomorrow and keep going until the email arrives. Some nights I still think about that hospital room, the ceiling tiles, the IV drip, the sound of the door clicking shut. The way Claire had said you'll be fine with tears in her eyes like she was the one losing something. Some nights I still count to 73 in the dark and feel the cold of that moment. That particular cold that isn't temperature but is something deeper. The cold of being alone in a way you hadn't expected to be alone. But then I think about the office, the Clyde through floor-to-ceiling glass, Moira beside me, the folder sliding across the desk, Claire's face when she understood that the girl she'd left in the hospital room had not remained in the hospital room. That whatever she'd meant by strong, whatever she'd meant by fine, she had underestimated both. "You will be fine," she said. She was right. I am fine. I am better than fine. I am someone who built an empire from ashes and then handed the instructions to her sister and told her, "Your turn. Let's see what you're made of." I know what I'm made of. That's worth more than the flat and the revenue and the flagship store and the press coverage combined. That knowledge, earned through the Mary Hill bedsit and the jacket potatoes and the bar soap for washing my hair, and the charity shop blankets and the 40-minute walks in January rain. That knowledge is mine, and no one can take it. She was wrong about who she was. I was right about who I was. And that clarity, that hard-won, earned-in-the-worst-way clarity, is worth more than any apology either of them could ever offer. It is worth more than my grandmother's ring. It is the thing I built from the inside out when everything external had been stripped away. And it is the one thing that was always mine and always will be. The ceiling tiles numbered 73. I know because I counted them. And then I stopped counting and started building. And I have never looked back. There's a reason why betrayal stories like this one resonate so deeply with us, and it goes beyond the satisfaction of watching karma arrive on schedule. Research in social psychology consistently shows that what makes betrayal uniquely devastating, compared to other forms of loss, is the combination of grief and identity disruption. When someone we love betrays us, we don't just lose them. We lose the version of ourselves that trusted them. We lose the world in which they were safe. We lose the certainty that our own judgment was sound. Studies on trust recovery show that rebuilding after deep betrayal takes on average 3 to 5 years. Not because the pain takes that long to fade, but because the reconstruction of self, the rebuilding of a trustworthy inner compass, takes that long. What makes this story extraordinary is not that she survived the betrayal. It's that she used it. That the same capacity for endurance and sacrifice that had been exploited by her sister became, when redirected toward herself and something she cared about, the exact engine of her success. The strength was never the problem. The direction of it was. And when she stopped giving it away and started investing it in herself, everything changed. That is the truth this story carries. Your deepest capacities are not diminished by what was done to you. They are clarified by it. If this story moved something in you, hit that like button. It costs nothing and it means everything to this channel. And I want to know, where are you watching from right now? And what time is it where you are? Drop it in the comments. And while you're down there, tell me what you would have done in her position. Would you have given Claire the folder? Or would you have done something entirely different? I want to read every response. If you haven't subscribed yet, now is the time. Stories like this one are what this channel is built for, and we drop new ones several times a week. You don't want to miss the next one. And speaking of the next one, that video sitting right there on your screen right now, I need you to watch it. The story it contains is one of the most extraordinary things I've heard. A story about a woman who spent 16 years building a life around a secret that wasn't hers to keep, and the single afternoon that changed everything for everyone involved. It starts quietly, and it ends with a moment I still think about weeks later. Click it. You won't regret it.